I rise today to call for an end to the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. Now, you might be excused for not knowing we're involved in the war in Yemen because the media seems to be preoccupied with other things. But we have been involved with supporting the Saudi coalition. Saudis aligned with 9 other nations, including Bahrain, who've been bombing Yemen. Now, you might not know much about Yemen either. Yemen is one of the poorest countries on the planet. There's about 17 million people who live on the edge of starvation there. This year, they suffered an epidemic of cholera. Over 1 million people had cholera and thousands of people died. This is a country so impoverished that even when there is no war in Yemen, they live on the very edge of being able to survive. The pictures are heartrending. If you see the pictures of the small children with their swollen bellies, swollen because they don't have enough protein, that the fluid literally drains from their blood system into their bellies. The pictures are heartrending. And your tax dollars are supporting this war. So I think there ought to be a debate. So that's what I stand up today to do, is to force a debate over whether or not we should be involved with aiding and abetting the Saudi coalition in this war in Yemen. You see, our founding fathers intended that Congress would debate war. It was very, very clear if you read the Federalist Papers, if you read the Constitution, if you read any of the founding fathers, if you read any of the first 8 presidents, they said explicitly again and again that the prerogative to declare war was Congress's, that it was specifically taken from the president, specifically forbidden of the president to go to war without the permission of Congress. So we've been having a little bit of this debate. About a month ago, we had a debate, and you know what? The administration argued that bombs are not war, that refueling planes that bomb people is not war, that we are not involved with hostilities in Yemen because we don't have troops marching on the ground with muskets. I think that's an absurd notion that you could be refueling bombing planes, supplying the bombs, and as bombs are raining down on people and civilians are killed, and the ones who survive pick up a scrap of the bomb and it says made in U.S., tell them we're not involved with the war in Yemen. Madison, among the founding fathers, was quite clear in saying that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, we have, with studied care, vested the power to declare war in Congress. We haven't obeyed that constitutional maxim for a long time. For a long time, we've basically abdicated our role. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, have let presidents, Republican and Democrat, do what they will. This war started under the previous president. This war continues under the current president. And yet Congress doesn't have the spine, doesn't have the will to stand up and say, that is our job to declare war. It's our job to represent the people, to listen to the people and decide whether we should be at war. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 says, Congress shall declare war. It is unequivocal. And yet here we are, involved in yet another war. We're involved in a war in Yemen. We've been involved in a war in Syria. We've also been involved in a war in Libya. We've also now been at war with people in Afghanistan who had nothing to do with 9/11 18 years later. These wars go on and on because Congress, and specifically the Senate, doesn't do their job. So you've heard people on television yelling, do your job at their legislators. Well, that's fine, but let's debate what our job is. The Constitution was very clear that one of our jobs is to declare war, and we have abdicated that responsibility and have not lived up to it. I would like to have a direct vote on whether we should be involved in Yemen, a direct vote on whether we either declare war or we don't. But that is forbidden because I'm in the minority, not in the minority party, but in the minority ideologically. The vast majority of this body doesn't care about directing foreign policy. They say the president has unitary authority. The commander-in-chief can do whatever he or she wants. That's what the vast majority of these people believe. So they will vote against this because they do not believe Congress really should tell the president when we go to war. I would like to vote directly that we should not be at war in Yemen, not be involved with supplying refueling or bombs to the Saudis, the Bahrainis, and their coalition. I'm forbidden from that vote But because of a 1976 law called the Arms Export Control Act, I'm able to object to arms sales. We've done this twice in the last year. We objected in a bipartisan way to sale of arms of Saudi Arabia because we thought their war was unjust, indiscriminate, killing civilians, and was not in America's best interest. The first time we had the vote, we got a little over 20 votes to say we should not be continuing to sell arms to the Saudis while they continue this abomination. 20-something votes out of 100. We lost overwhelmingly. We had another vote about 2 or 3 months ago. We got 47 votes. Now we've had the killing and dismemberment of a journalist and dissident by the name of Khashoggi. Something so brazen, so bizarre, so uncivilized that people are now coming together. In the last few weeks, we've quit refueling planes, and yet the bombs continue to drop. We're still supplying the bombs. Things are beginning to change. There is a movement among the public to hold their representatives accountable and say, why are we at war in Yemen? Why don't you vote on whether we should be at war in Yemen? Why do you abdicate your responsibility to the president? See, it's harder for someone like me because the president's of my party, and I agree with him on many different issues. But where's the other side? The other side, they should be rising up and saying this is a usurpation of power. The president is taking upon himself power that is not his. The other side should be rising up unanimously and saying, enough's enough. We are taking back this power. See, people talk about this all the time. People pretend to be believers in congressional checks and balances. There's all these groups out there for checks and balances yet. This is a check and a balance. This is a time in which the Senate can tell the president what to do. But watch the votes. Many of the people you see on TV saying, we should stand up and the president this and the president that, on this issue, which is an honest issue of disagreement with the president, stand up and restrict his power. Stand up and tell the president, the Constitution says that war shall be declared by Congress. But watch the votes here. We won't get a direct vote on the war, though. We'll get an indirect. We won't even get to vote today on Saudi arms because they're afraid to put forth Saudi arms because they think we might win. But we will vote on one of the coalition partners. The Bahrainis are part of a 9-country coalition fighting this war. They've had casualties, they've dropped bombs, they've been on the ground in Yemen. They are part of the fighting coalition. And so the resolution today will be specifically about not selling one set of arms sales to Bahrain. Now, the other side will look for all kinds of excuses to say, no, oh my goodness, Bahrain has been a great ally. I'm not disputing that. What I'm disputing is that they're getting the message that we are unhappy. We supply them with all of their arms, all right? We get to host our Navy there. Great. They're an ally. Great. I'm not asking that we end our alliance. I'm not asking that we sanction them. I'm only saying stop one sale of arms to send a message that we are done with the war in Yemen, that we are no longer going to sell weapons to countries that are fighting this war in Yemen, that the war must come to a close. And some will argue, well, it's already kind of winding down. We're no longer refueling their planes. And yet, since Secretary Pompeo said about 3 weeks ago that the Saudi coalition should quit bombing civilian centers, the Saudis have dropped 200 bombs on Hodeidah. Hodeidah is a city where most of the humanitarian effort and food comes in. Yemen depends, 80% of their food must be imported. Comes through this one port for the most part. The Saudis, since we admonished them, since Secretary Pompeo said they need to cease and desist from bombing civilian centers, the Saudis have dropped 200 more bombs on the city of Hodeidah where the humanitarian aid comes in. It must stop. Someone must take a stand and say enough's enough. We are against the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. They will argue, well, then vote on that. I can't have a direct vote on that. They will not let me vote on whether or not we should be at war in Yemen. I am only allowed to vote on this one small thing, but this is a proxy vote. This is a vote that represents whether or not we should be at war in Yemen. It's an incredibly important vote. It is an attempt to grab back power from the presidency. It's an attempt to have a check and balance on all presidents of all parties, of all beliefs. I don't think that we should ever sell one arm, one musket, one shotgun to create a job. Our arms industry is for our national defense. It is a unique industry that is not an entirely private enterprise industry. The arms manufacturer, the military-industrial complex, is supported overwhelmingly by tax dollars. I'm not for anybody being able to buy an F-16. I'm not for selling F-16s to Russia or to China, but I'm also not for selling any more to Saudi Arabia. I'm not for fixing their planes. I'm not for giving them replacement parts. Their Air Force would be shut down in a matter of months if we stopped funding them. People say, oh, it's too dramatic. Oh, you're doing things they've been such a great ally. We had a senator rise yesterday in our lunch, and he said, well, we know he's not a Democrat. We know he doesn't believe in representative government. We know he's a thug. And of course they execute and crucify people in Saudi Arabia. It's just, it's the best we can do, and we need him, vis-a-vis Iran. What will happen? Iran will take over the world if we don't combat them in every little misbegotten civil war in the Middle East. Well, here's the point. And this is a point we should debate and nobody debates. Who is more evil? The Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollah of Iran or the Saudi Arabian kingdom? If you look at it objectively, Saudi Arabia spent over $100 billion teaching hatred of Christians, Hindus, and Jews around the world. They have opened tens of thousands of madrasas. The Haqqani network that actually has killed our soldiers in Afghanistan are supplied with money by the Saudis. The Taliban has gotten money from the Saudis. There was a report that a Saudi royal dropped off a check for $267 million to the Taliban at one point. So we're fighting these people and we're arming people. We should not be arming the enemy. It's not just one side. The other side has admitted this as well. It's not just Republicans saying this. Hillary Clinton said in a cable that was leaked that Saudi Arabia was the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorists worldwide. What's it like to live in Saudi Arabia? We might ask Barik al-Nimr. He was arrested at 17 at a protest. He's still in jail. He's scheduled to be executed. They have a real, gloriful way of executing you in Saudi Arabia. They chop your head off and then they crucify you. So his head will be chopped off and then his body will be displayed in a crucifixion pose. That's what they will do to him. He was 17 when he's arrested. They have beheaded minors in Saudi Arabia. But we buy their oil and their sheiks we're such good friends with their sheiks and their kings. In Saudi Arabia right now, there are 3,000 people in prison who have not gotten a trial. There's nearly 1,000 people that have been in prison for 3 years without trial. 3 years without trial, 1,000 people. And yet we continue to say, oh, yes, but they oppose Iran. Who's worse, Iran or Saudi Arabia? Maybe neither one of them are good. Do you want to send your son or your daughter to fight for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? No. Do you want to send your son or daughter to fight for the Saudi kings who crucify people? No. Maybe we don't always have to pick sides. Maybe there's a time that comes when the 1,000-year-old war between Sunni and Shia, let them fight it. Is there a reason we always have to send our sons and daughters to the Middle East? People used to say, oh, you got to do it for oil, which was offensive to me. We're doing it for oil and oil profits. We are independent now of their oil. We export oil. We do not need Saudi Arabia. People say, we got to have them or Iran will take over the world. Saudi Arabia spends 8 times more. Saudi Arabia and their coalition partners spend 8 times more on military than Iran. And what happens every time we send $1 to Saudi Arabia? Iran then asks Russia for stuff. So it's an arms race that is fueled by both of the larger outside powers with their proxies, and everything's a proxy war. But if you fool yourself into thinking, oh, Saudi Arabia's a good guy and Iran's the bad guy, you have to ask yourself about the $2 billion that Saudi Arabia spent in India. $2 billion over a 2-year period teaching hatred of Hindus, hatred of Jews, hatred of Christianity, teaching that violent jihad is okay. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars spent by the Saudis, and yet people say, well, we make a buck and we can create a job. I, for one, would not try to create one job by selling arms to people who are our enemy. I don't care about jobs if we're going to have to sell arms to our enemies. The arms belong to the American people, and the arms should be seen as a national security asset. We don't sell arms to Russia, we don't sell arms to China, and we shouldn't sell arms to the Saudis who teach hatred of Christianity. You know, there are Saudi cities you can't even go to. Christians can't go to Mecca or Medina. You can't carry a Bible in Saudi Arabia. You try to visit Saudi Arabia and bring a Bible in, you'll be rejected at the border. This is not what we're for. Even those who have advocated for the war are now admitting there's no military solution. Recently, Secretary Pompeo said, no military solution in Yemen. Let's seize the bombing. General Mattis has said the same thing, no military solution. But they're not getting the signal. We're telling them there's no military solution. We're telling them to quit bombing civilian areas, and they're still bombing the areas. Since Secretary Pompeo told them a few weeks ago to quit bombing civilian areas, they've dropped 200 bombs on Hodeidah. The Saudis aren't getting the message. The Bahrainis are part of the coalition. Send them a message. I'm not saying we sanction Bahrain. I'm not saying we kick them out as an ally. I'm not saying we end our relationship with the Bahrainis. I'm saying don't sell them arms one time. You think they'll get the message? See, that's a message of strength. A lot of people around here talk about we must have peace through strength and we need to have a strong military. Well, you know what? We need to have a strong foreign policy that says we're not going to be pushed around by a bunch of two-bit dictators in the Middle East. We're not going to be led astray and to reject all of our values by sending arms into a war where civilians are being killed by the thousands. 17 million people in Yemen live on the edge of starvation. The city that a lot of the humanitarian aid comes in through, Hodeidah, it's blockaded by the Saudis. I think when we make decisions on foreign policy, first they should be made here. The Constitution intended that we declare war and that really foreign policy come from the people through the Congress, both House and Senate. If we were to have that debate, we would ask the question, is our involvement in the war in Yemen in our national security interest? Is our national security enhanced by being at war in Yemen? I think the question is unequivocally no. To those who say, well, we must combat Iran, Iran is being combated by Saudi Arabia, but Iran is not a threat to come across the ocean to see us. Guess who has come across the ocean? You remember 9/11? You remember who the hijackers were? 15 of 19 of them were from Saudi Arabia. Remember the 28 pages in the 9/11 report that they wouldn't let the American public read for years and years and years, for over a decade? You can now read those. And the implication is that Saudi Arabia was involved in 9/11, perhaps in the financing, perhaps in the planning. We actually voted overwhelmingly to allow American people, descendants of those who died on 9/11, to actually sue Saudi Arabia over this, because of the implication that, yes, the 28 pages showed that they were involved. So what we should be debating here is there a national security risk? Or is there a national security enhancement? Is it better for our country? Is it good for America to be involved in the war in Yemen? Or does it actually enhance the risks that will be involved in further war and further drawn into the Middle East? If you look at the history of our involvement in the Middle East, and President Trump gets this very well, one of the things he says over and over again is that the Iraq War was a mistake, that it was a geopolitical blunder of immeasurable proportions. Why? It's the same thing that's happened over and over again in the Middle East. We go in and we topple a strong man. The strong man has a horrible human rights record, and we say, we're bringing freedom and democracy. You know what we get? We topple the strong man and we get chaos. And even decades later, look, in Afghanistan, decades later, we still have chaos. You had chaos in Iraq. You have chaos now in Syria. You have chaos in Yemen. You have chaos in Libya. But it's not made better by our intervention. It's actually made worse. Out of the chaos springs more terrorism. Terrorism loves chaos. It's sort of like, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, terrorism loves a vacuum. So terrorism grows and thrives and becomes more organized when they have a vacuum. My fear in Yemen is, as the war goes on, as both sides destroy each other in a war that has no real end, that maybe Al-Qaeda of Yemen does come back, and Al-Qaeda of Yemen becomes a dominant player. Where did ISIS come? People said, oh, ISIS was from Iraq. ISIS grew in Syria from Raqqa. They started there. They moved into Iraq because even after 15 years, the Iraqis were feckless to stop them. But they grew in the chaos of Syria. Who did we supply in Syria with weapons? Well, there was another post from Hillary Clinton to Podesta saying, we've got to do something about Saudi Arabia and Qatar because they're indiscriminately supplying arms to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. So because we always think you've got to be involved, there can never be a time when we're not fighting on one side or the other, we get involved with the lesser of two evils. And so often the lesser of two evils is, guess what? Still evil. And so what's happened is we're drug into everybody's wars, war on end in the Middle East, without resolution. They've been killing each other for 1,000 years. And we think somehow siding with the Sunnis against the Shia is going to bring this war to a conclusion. The thing is that I think it's been a mistake. I think it's been counterproductive. I think the war in Yemen is counterproductive. I think that our involvement there is leading to more chaos. I think the Senate has abdicated their duty and their role. Under Article 1, Section 8, the Senate is allowed to and should be deciding when we go to war. People talk about checks and balances, and we should be involved. Somehow we should check the president who's assuming too much authority. This is your chance today. This is the check and balance. This is your proxy vote on the war in Yemen. There will be no direct war in Yemen because they won't allow it. This will be a proxy vote because it'll be about weapons to Bahrain because we're not being allowed a direct vote on the war in Yemen. We should be. It should be one of the most important things we do and function in the Senate, and that is to direct foreign policy, to decide when we go to war. It's probably the most important thing we do under the Constitution, and we've abdicated it for decade after decade. I think the American people's frustration with Saudi Arabia is growing. I think the American people want a loud message sent. If you send any other message, some are proposing sanctions on the killers. Well, they're in jail, and in all likelihood, they're going to be executed. So we're going to sanction a bunch of people who are in jail and going to be executed. The Saudis will laugh at that. That is weakness. Even since the last 3 weeks, since Secretary Pompeo said, you need to quit, you need to cease and desist from bombing civilian areas, the Saudis have dropped 200 bombs on civilian areas in Hodeidah. They're not getting the message. If we want to send them a message and send them a message loud and clear, we need to tell them no more arms. Now, the next time they post a weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, we'll do the same thing. But this is about the entire coalition of 9 countries that are involved in this. Today it'll be about Bahrain, but today it's really about Yemen. It's about the question I began this with. My call today is to end the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. We should have debated this in advance. We should have debated this before we got involved with the war in Yemen. And yet there's this creeping mission that happens all the time. The wars begin with the executive branch, they creep and grow larger and larger, and we abdicate our duty and role to vote on these things. Today's an opportunity to say enough's enough, the war in Yemen should end. It won't be the direct message I'd like to send to Saudi Arabia, but it will be an indirect message. If this resolution were to pass, yes, it would be a loud and clear message that we're serious. But what will happen, and you'll watch closely, is many members will say, oh, Bahrain's our ally, we can't do this to our ally. I'm not talking about ending our relationship with Bahrain. I'm not talking about never selling arms to them. I'm talking about one time, today, don't send them arms. What's the drama about? How could that to me is a very modest step. One time, not sell their arms. They can be sold in 6 months. Quit bombing Yemen. Pull out of the coalition. Stop the fight. We'll talk about the arms sales. One time, we should stand up and we should send a message from the Senate to the President that we're in charge under Article 1, Section 8, Declaration of War comes from Congress. We've abdicated for too long that role, and my hope is today that there will be enough of us to send a message, and the message should be loud and clear. We should end, the U.S. should end their involvement in the war in Yemen.